Hello and welcome again. In this segment of the presentation, I want to talk about the first Yugoslav state that was established after the end of the First World War, some of the challenges that it faced. So I'm just going to walk you through a basic outline of its establishment, of some of the history, and how it is eventually destroyed. The focus here is going to be on the fundamental tensions that undermined the stability and sustainability of the state. Let's begin right at the end of the First World War. Now, the first state is formed. It doesn't take the name Yugoslavia until later as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And the king of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes is the Alexander Karađorđević, the king of Serbia. It's formed in a hurry at the end of the First World War. And this is possibly important because when we were talking about the tensions between Prime Minister Pasic representing Serbia and Ante Trumbic representing the Yugoslav Committee, you could see two different visions of what the state that was going to be formed ought to be. It ends up that Pasic prevails, that the former Austro-Hungarian territories decide to join the new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Partly because as the Paris Peace Conferences are going on, and I'm not going to dwell on the Paris Peace Conferences here, I think we've already brought out the most important elements, there is a threat faced by what would later become Slovenia and Croatia that Italy would invade in order to gain protection. There is a quick decision to join the state that is being formed with its center in Serbia. So this is formed as its original name is the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. So the idea is this is the state of the South Slav people, and the South Slav people are identified as being Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Now, cultural ideologists of the Yugoslav idea, people like Ivan Meštrović, who I talked about in the last portion of the presentation, promoted this idea of the South Slavic people as one people with three names, in this case Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. But let's point out some of the tensions that are already apparent from the beginning. First, not everybody who is in this new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes is a Serb, a Croat, or a Slovene. There are other groups here that are not represented as titular groups within the new state. Second, this is a state that is eventually formed by the extension of the political power of Serbia over territories that had been lost by the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, and it was highly centralized and dominated by the political elite of Serbia, leading to some predictable dissatisfaction among the elites of other regions, particularly in Croatia, which had the second largest ethnic or national population in the new state, and had its own political elite that had developed during the period of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was competitive with the Serbian political elite that had developed in the Kingdom of Serbia. As a result, the greatest conflict, there were lots of conflicts within the first Yugoslavia, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, but the one that recurs constantly and that undermines the stability of the state constantly, that erupts occasionally into violence, is the conflict between the political elites of Serbia and Croatia within the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Let's dwell a little bit on this conflict between the separatist impulses that existed in Serbia and the centralist impulses in Croatia, and the centralist impulses that existed in Serbia. So like all of the national states that were created in this period of emergence of national states, there were members of groups that were not part of the titular carriers of nationhood. In the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, there were about 2 million of these, or 17% of the population. Second, because you had a state that was formed out of territories that had been under different forms of legal control. The Ottoman Empire, the Kingdom of Montenegro, the Kingdom of Serbia, the Austrian portion of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Hungarian portion of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was a state which had territories that had inherited legal systems that were different from one another and not entirely consistent with one another, and these legal and administrative systems in all of their complexity operated on territories with tremendous economic differences in terms of income, level of urbanization, level of development, with linguistic differences, a number of languages spoken in conflict over what would constitute and what would function as a language of administration, and religious differences, that is, institutions representing forms of identity that were inconsistent and sometimes competitive with one another. So this is a territory where there was bound to be some kind of competition, where it was probable that much of this competition would develop into tension, sometimes into violence, and this is made additionally complex by the fact that the new state lives in a hostile neighborhood. That is to say, there are other states which have designs upon its territory, including Italy, which had established control over a portion of what, after the Second World War, would be part of Yugoslavia, but which certainly had its own ambitions to control parts of what had been earlier territories of the Empire of Venice, in Istra and Dalmatia, in the coast all the way down to Albania. Hungary, with claims over territories which had a large ethnic Hungarian population. Bulgaria and Greece, each of which had their own types of claims to territories in what is now the Republic of North Macedonia, and so on. Albania, which had an interest in the status of large Albanian-speaking populations in the territory of what is now Kosovo and what is now Macedonia. So these are states that were not permitted to develop peacefully because of the constant presence of security threats. There were various efforts to try to find and impose resolutions to the basic tensions that undermined the stability of the state. In the beginning, the central control exercised by Serbia was very strong. This was a unitarist system, but it was a system which, although there were forms of local control, there were assurances that in most of the districts of the country, this control would be exercised by either politicians who were ethnically Serbian or by political parties based in Serbia or with their base of power in the Serbian population in different territories. This was a system that was unstable and violent. There were dramatic expressions of this violence, including the murder of the leader of the Croatian Peasant Party on the floor of the Yugoslav parliament in 1924. When it was clear that the system was unsustainable, in 1929, King Alexander Karađorđević imposes a dictatorship, suspends the constitution, and attempts to ban parties that are based on nationality. There is a requirement that for a political party to operate, it needs to have representation in all parts of the country and membership from all ethnic groups. There is an ambitious attempt to try to impose different kinds of unification in terms of religion, education, administration, and culture. There is a territorial reorganization of the country in which the effort is to separate territories from national majorities and national control. I'll show you in the next slide a map of what this Banovina system, the deterritorialization of political control, looks like in the next slide. This was controversial. It was met with major resistance. The expression of this resistance was severe, so King Alexander was murdered on a visit to France in 1934. There follows another period period of conflict and instability, this is followed by a period in which there is an attempt to resolve tension by granting as many as possible of the demands of the Croatian political elite in an agreement that was reached in 1939. I will show you a map and talk a bit about that agreement as well, which provides an autonomous territory for Croatia. And we have no way of knowing whether this agreement would have been successful or not because another war intervened. Let's talk a little bit about the federal system. So King Alexander, who was murdered in 1934, in 1929, he imposes the system of the Banovine. What's important about this system is that there is an attempt to avoid the division of the state into nationally or ethnically defined territories. So he has created these districts of governance, provinces or states, if you want to call them that. All of them are named after geographical features. That is, none of them are given national names or national territories, although you could say that that probably each of them has a certain national or ethnic majority, but there's an attempt to impose on all of them an identity that is fundamentally Yugoslav, but because of the character of political and economic control in the country, a Yugoslav character in which the predominant identity is Serbian. This is a system that looks like a resolution. There is an attempt to downplay the political role of national differences, but when downplaying them meant suppressing them, the result was to increase rather than decrease tension. This system was proven to be unsustainable, something demonstrated, I think, not only by the assassination of King Alexander himself, but also by the continued escalation of ethnic and national tension and occasionally violence within the state. There is a final attempt to resolve the fundamental conflict between Serbian and Croatian centers of political power, and this comes in 1939 with the agreement between Dragiša Cvetković, who was the prime minister at the time, and Vladimir Maček, the head of the largest ethnic Croatian political party, the Croatian Peasant Party. And in this one, the territorial organization of the state is restructured, and the main element of the restructuring you can see in the map on the slide in the part that is colored in green. That is the creation of a semi-autonomous region of the state, the Croatian Banovina, or district. So essentially, this was an agreement to provide a level of self-governance to the ethnic Croat population and to try to enhance the level of equality within the state. This agreement was celebrated as a success. It was popular among both the Serbian and Croatian populations. Would it have contributed to resolving the tension in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, the name that the kingdom took after 1929 with the establishment of the royal dictatorship? Unfortunately, this is a question to which we will never have the answer, and that's because the state was only able to function under this agreement for 2 years. In 1941, in the context of the Second World War, Yugoslavia is invaded and conquered by Nazi Germany, and that is the end of the first state of Yugoslavia. In the next section, I want to talk about what happens a little bit during, but mostly after the Second World War, and how the regime that came to power in the Second World War tried and partly succeeded and partly failed in addressing the question of inter-ethnic tension and national tension that was always the weak point of the Yugoslav state.